Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Stream Time Sports. I'm your host Nick Meacham, and today being joined by a debutant to the Stream Time Sports podcast, I'm here with Josh Sim, reporter at Sports Pro. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm glad to get the call off the bench for this one.
Josh has made several appearances on the Sports Pro podcast channel, so not unfamiliar to perhaps some of your ears, but good to have you on the show. Now, Josh, I want to talk a little bit today with you. You did a really good piece around women's football, and I know from following your Twitter accounts or maybe threads these days, is that we start shifting away from the X platform a little bit. You do have a pretty keen interest in European football. I think Bundesliga was one of your preferred areas and preferred leagues to follow. So, yeah, Josh, for you in terms of sports properties, I spent some time this weekend watching some other sports that I'm not usually following. Have you been keeping an eye on anything recently, any new sports or new ways of watching that you have piqued your interest?
Yeah, I think, obviously, being at Sports Pro, we've covered a lot of US sports and a lot of college sports as well. And I happened to be scrolling around my TikTok feed on the weekend and came across Fox Sports' coverage of the Iowa college basketball game, featuring Caitlin Clark, who's obviously this big superstar destined for great things. And what was interesting is Fox Sports had a camera specifically focusing on her that they were always live streaming on TikTok. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way to cover an athlete who's obviously got huge social media following and sort of taking the opportunity to sort of showcase every move she makes on a platform like TikTok. I thought that was an interesting move. I don't know if you've seen anything or heard of anything like that before, but it seems like a pretty new approach, and one that, I don't know what the numbers were for how many people tuned in, but if it proves to be quite big, then I'm sure other broadcasters may look into it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a player cam has been something that's been played with and tested over the years, but it's never really stuck, right? But it does feel like the vertical video format that TikTok provides is really built for that single player experience. I'm curious, how close was the shot? Was it sort of just literally? I'm trying to think of that, maybe using some sort of producer or AI tech just to follow the player, using the same sort of closeness to the player as you would see in a normal game, or was it much closer up where you in Fox, I think, were one of the first ones to move with that camera, which they would do the walkarounds on at the NFL, and I think with the golf as well, where you feel like the players look like they're in 6K. Is it that sort of closeness, or is it much more just taking in a chunk of the existing footage, you think, and bringing that to life in a vertical format?
I think it still felt like it had come from the broadcast. It didn't give you the feeling that you were sidelines, for instance. It was very much sort of the broadcast, but obviously having her sort of centered at all times and the camera was sort of moving around, as obviously basketball is such a sport that requires a lot of movement and stuff. It sort of had to sort of adjust itself with her. So yeah, it wasn't any, like, I don't know, it wasn't as particularly in closer proximity than one would normally expect, but it was still quite interesting. And, as I just touched on, basketball is such a moving sport. I imagine it's quite hard to sort of keep hold of one person at all times. So it did a pretty decent job, at least, of keeping up with her and keeping her in shot throughout the whole time, I get, it'll be interesting to see if other sports, given, I guess, obviously at Sports Pro, we have the 50 most marketable athletes list and stuff, and seeing all these younger college stars sort of become more and more prominent. It'll be interesting to see if other broadcasters choose to do suit with some of the other big college stars.
Yeah, big time. I mean, I think the interesting things around someone like a Caitlin Clark is they're probably able to generate more revenue and support and endorsements through the NIL dynamic than they are potentially before they make the WNBA, because of the differences what the NIL does in terms of earnings. But anyway, that's a good scene setter, because we're talking about women's sports in particular and how they're looking to generate more income. This weekend, I was actually watching a bit of pickleball for the first time on TV, and I was surprised that it was a good watch, though it was helpful that they had Andre Agassi and John McEnroe and Steffi Graf and all these famous people that I could resonate with. So I could see this. I can understand a little bit more now why it's something that people are getting some excitement about, but I don't see any way, shape, or form that sport could possibly be something that competes with anything bigger than a tier 3 sports property. But it's a nice, easy piece of content to make, and it wasn't a bad thing to digest. Have you played pickleball or watched any pickleball yourself?
I've seen snippets. I've not had the opportunity to partake in pickleball, but I mean, I've seen obviously the explosion of the sport, and obviously there's a sort of still pretty young league at the moment in the US, but it looks like a lot of the big sort of athletes in the US and around the world are sort of starting to put money into it. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it sort of breaks through from, I guess, wherever it is into maybe a tier two, or obviously the goal would be a tier one. But yeah, it seems like it's a really accessible sport as well for people who sort of getting their feet wet into it for sure.
Well, I do think it does say something about the sport that the most famous people I've watched so far are people that retired 20 years ago from the sport. So, yeah, maybe a little bit more easier on the body than some, and then tennis and other sports. But was not a bad watch. But I can't see it, becoming, watching it like in the same way you watch some of these gladiator like fights between some of the top players of the past at Wimbledon. It doesn't quite have the same appeal. But anyway, we're here to talk about women's sports and particularly women's football. And look, the thing, Josh, that I want to bring you on is to talk about, off the back of the article you wrote recently around the free to air versus pay TV conundrum that pretty much all the sports is facing at some stage, but particularly with women's football now, as it's on such a growth trajectory. Just what were some of the things that you sort of talked about in that article, which is obviously on the Sports Pro website, with regards to that dynamic?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was the article was based off an interview done on the sister podcasts of Sports Pro. So I encourage people to go check that out and hear all the quotes in its complete context and entirety. But yeah, it was an interview done with Lena from Wasserman and Joe Tung, who's an agent to the likes of Emma Hayes and Leah Williamson, and they were talking about sort of the different challenges that women's football is going to face this year, and specifically when it comes to broadcast. Obviously, in England, the Women's Super League domestic rights deal is we expect it to be agreed at some point this year, and it'll be interesting to see sort of what approach they take to it. We obviously expect like a massive uptick in revenue, like the NWSL achieved at the back end of last year. But yeah, the article went into about whether it was right for those leagues to be pursuing sort of big revenue numbers at what cost when it comes to sort of coverage, and how important is free to air coverage. So it touched on a lot of different things that I'm sure those leading the sport at the moment are sort of wrestling with as well, in terms of how to grow the audience of that sport, whilst also ensuring that it is commercially viable for the foreseeable future and beyond.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like we're at a real tipping point where there's some big decisions that need to be made that will take various properties in completely different directions depending on what they do go with. I.e., if you decide to go down the free-to-air angle, particularly in markets like the UK, that's a commitment that you might be taking less money and generating less income for the near future. But the net benefit is you'll scale those audiences to have more fan interest. So in the next cycle, then maybe you will be able to get a bigger check or be able to make sure your rights are diversified versus taking the cash now and making sure you can professionalize a bit quicker. So it's a real interesting test bed. And I think WSL is probably, out of the different leagues, which I want to talk about, they're probably, I guess, in the most mature position with regards to, well, historically up until this point, although there's now a lot potential change in the air. So Josh, for those that aren't familiar too much with the WSL's sort of situation there, obviously they have deals in place with Sky and BBC from a broadcasting perspective. But you mentioned that there could be some changes in their organization. Could you just sort of explain to that for those that aren't familiar what that actually means?
Yeah, so we've sort of written about it at length on the Sports Pro website, but towards the end of last year, it was sort of finally announced. It was sort of in the offing for a while that the WSL and its the Championship, the second tier league, are going to be run by a new independent commercial body called NewCo. I guess I'm sure there'll be a more formal name to come. It's going to be led by Nikki Doucette, who formerly worked at Nike, and that body will be tasked with sort of securing stronger commercial revenue for the entirety of the league and its clubs. And obviously that will involve this media rights deal, which is coming up. So yeah, there's some governance changes there. The FA are going to take a step back, and it sort of unleashes the reins a bit on the WSL, and it gets to sort of test its market viability. And yeah, it's a huge year in terms of testing how valuable and how much are people willing to sort of invest in women's football going forward, where it sits in terms of the current market landscape.
Yeah, definitely. But the WSL is trying to set itself up basically to be the Premier League of women's football, right? The number one league in the world. And I'm not sure if they're there yet. Do you have a sense of whether they are qualified in position in that way? Whether there's different metrics, I suppose, on how you would measure that. Is the WSL in that number one league bracket, or is it a bit more balanced than, say, the Premier League is in the men's game?
I think it does, certainly against its sort of European counterparts. It certainly seems to be drawing, in terms of sort of the attendances in stadium. It seems to sort of hit the mark, especially when they have select WSL games held in the men's stadiums, and you sort of see the Emirates Stadium get sold out, sort of 50,000 or whatever, attending the games. So in that respect, I think it is, and obviously, the NWSL is a different kettle of fish. It's obviously been, I would say, probably matured a lot earlier than the WSL, so it's hard to sort of put them together. But yeah, and the WSL seems to be, at the moment, in Europe at least, a very strong contender to be sort of the number one sort of commercially viable league. And again, and this will be an interesting test to see, how far it goes, and if it sets a blueprint for all these other leagues, European leagues, to follow as well.
For sure. So they seem to have a nice mix with a little bit of free to air, a lot of support from Sky Sports to bring WSL's coverage and the conversation around them to the fore. BBC has really ramped up its media and sort of editorial coverage as well. I actually find it quite interesting how they're intentionally publishing stuff now that you're not sure sometimes when they publish something whether it's about the men's or the women's game, because they just use the names of the clubs. And so I think that's actually a really good move to try and generate more interest and more awareness of what's going on in the space when it's appropriate, of course, at least for now. But it seems like they've got the right mix, I suppose, that most sports properties would be wanting to grow. Now but looking across the pond, as they say, to the NWSL, the American League. Talk to us just about what the mix is there, because they've gone through a pretty significant process with working with IMG. So what's the situation there from a media perspective?
Yeah, so like I sort of mentioned earlier, in November, the latest sort of cycle of deals got announced, with NWSL now partners with Amazon, CBS, ESPN, and Scripps. So 4 different broadcast partners. The deals combined are worth about $240 million across a 4-year cycle. In terms of how they break down per broadcaster, Amazon get regular match season games on Friday nights. Scripps get double headers on free-to-air television. And then we have CBS will show games obviously on CBS, on its CBS Sports network channel and the Paramount Plus streaming service. And ESPN also gets a package of its own for ABC, ESPN, those linear channels, and ESPN Plus. So a mix of, obviously, Amazon being the streaming service, Scripps with its sort of free-to-air capabilities, and then obviously CBS and ESPN sort of, obviously titans in terms of cable broadcasting, but also showing games on their streaming services. So a real mix of different mediums that people are going to be watching the NWSL for the next 4 years or so.
Yeah, just for context, the difference in average annual value that went from $1.5 million to $60 million. So that equates to about a 3,900% increase in revenue deal to deal per year. That was from a report from MoffettNathanson. So yeah, a big increase. I mean, it's also very relative though. If you look at some of the deals that exist and are happening in the US, but it is a huge step forward. The valuations on some of the clubs in the NWSL don't actually make a lot of sense to me in terms of the scale, as in they're just disproportionate to the amount of revenue these clubs are making. But everyone is taking big bets out there because they believe that there's a lot of growth still to be had. And for the NWSL to get a deal in place with not only a significant increase in revenue, but also that mix of major broadcasters who can really help tell the story. I think having ESPN on board is such an important part of it, because it ensures that they're in the conversation across all the relative news and magazine shows. I've said this a lot when I've talked about Premier League and Sky. Like, one of the big things that Sky brings to the table is that constant dialogue with fans around what's happening in the Premier League. That Amazon and Prime Video does not bring that. You you can access the live content, but that is it. So no, it looks like the deal was or the set of deals is a really good situation for the NWSL. But it doesn't have any of a sort of own direct to consumer angle. It is all just sort of farming out their content to other players. What's your view, Josh? Do you think that this day and age we hear a lot of conversation about going direct to fans and consumers? Do you think something like the NWSL or even the WSL, these types of leagues, which are at the pointy end of the women's football pyramid, so to speak, they should be considering that in this mix this day and age? Or do you think it's still about reach and getting audience numbers and obviously the best deals possible?
I think it's still about reach. You think about sort of what kind of audiences these leagues strengthened in, like their core audience. And again, listening to the podcast, Joe Tung makes a really good point where it's a lot of the, fans I see at WSL games are young girls and teenagers and in that sort of young adult category. And if you put games behind a paywall, make them pay a subscription, one, they may be relying on their parents on it, and two, I don't know that it's not as easy to reach. It's not easy to find. So I think that sort of having that free to air component is important. Also, just it's easier to drum up support amongst people who aren't as maybe clued up on the league if it's on free to air. Like I imagine if you're someone who maybe doesn't have a Sky Sports, maybe you're not a big sports fan at all, and suddenly it's on sort of prime time afternoon TV, then it becomes a lot more appealing. So I think having that free to air component is so important. I don't think we're at that stage yet where a league can fully rely on a paid TV broadcaster to sort of supply them that huge audience yet. I think it's still growing. I think there's still a way to go before we get to that stage. So yeah, I think those leagues are pretty smart to sort of keep a free-to-air component, and I'm sure that's what those at the WSL are considering when looking at their next deal, and I'm sure that's what the NWSL also considered during their negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, from my view now, it's just, I think, a more modern approach to make sure that at the very least you have the free-to-air audience and the reach there, because if you do have the scale, then it does open opportunities for sponsorship dollars. We've seen, I think the latest report I saw from somewhere, I didn't bring it with me for this pod, but it was something like 15% year-on-year increase in sponsorship revenues across the US alone. Like, if sponsorship used to be one of these things that how people would talk about how they're going to continue to drive more value for potential sponsors to get involved. And whilst maybe some of the blue chip businesses are not as active as they used to be in like European markets, there still seems to be a huge appetite for sponsorship. And where do you drive sponsorship from? It's a lot easier to drive sponsorship if you have a big reach and big audience number, unfortunately. So I think in many ways, I think this model is just a better modern way to try and drive value for anyone outside of the tier ones, of course, that have a completely different approach to everyone else involved. Josh, so we've talked a little bit about NWSL. We've talked a bit about WSL. Let's talk a bit more about Europe. The one that's, there's obviously leagues in all key markets in Germany, Spain, France. I think France is now on DAZN's channel in the French market. I'm not too sure about the women's league in Germany or Spain. Do you have any insight on those, or at least around the UEFA Champions League? Because that's the deal I wanted to talk about most.
Yeah, I think I can say that DAZN have the rights to the Spanish league. I think it's exclusive rights, and they also do for the Frauen Bundesliga in Germany. I think they had the domestic rights, and then they've then acquired the international rights as well. So it's sort of your go-to place, I guess, if you want to watch football from that league. And similar in Italy, I think Italy, there's a mix. Rai, I think, have a package, so obviously free-to-air coverage there. But DAZN also have a package. So DAZN have really, as we've seen, doubled down on their coverage of women's football. And you mentioned the Women's Champions League, which I'm sure we're about to discuss. They obviously made a big investment into that and have showed it on YouTube. They've showed games on their YouTube channels, and then obviously were considering taking all the games behind the paywall, but as I'm sure we're about to discuss, they decided to U-turn on that. So yeah, but I guess the bottom line is DAZN obviously have made a massive play in terms of for women's football in Europe, and it's they've really sort of cemented themselves as maybe the go-to place for women's football if you're a fan of women's football in Europe.
Yeah, completely. It is an interesting situation. They also acquired Atta Football,
Yeah.
which was a dedicated women's football platform. And again, another guest on the show,
Hannah.
Hannah Brown. Hannah
Yeah.
Brown. But they've acquired that, so they've really beefed out their approach to women's football. They are probably the. I'm trying to think of other sports that would have such a centralized, I guess, market position like this. So DAZN really own now women's football. Now, your point, which is what I do want to talk about, is this sort of really kicked off actually from off the back of the UEFA Champions League deal, where the deal was done as kind of like a three-way deal between YouTube, DAZN, and UEFA. My understanding at the time, not 100% on this, but there was not a lot of money put into that deal, but there was a commitment into how much effort and energy and production was going to go into it. So, as far as I understand, the production was actually paid for, I believe, by UEFA, and therefore the content was created, and then DAZN was going to be able to distribute and publish it on its platforms, with the goal always to bring it into their own ecosystem for that final year of the deal, to try and see if it could drive subscriptions and impact. Now, I went through a period, and I had talked about on the podcast before, where I was speaking to a lot of people in the industry, and particularly even some people at DAZN, and I never felt, they never said anything, but I never felt there was a layer of confidence in that approach. Whether it was the numbers they were seeing, I've seen presentations by YouTube and UEFA and DAZN about how great it's performed on YouTube, but I never felt there was the real confidence in that this approach of putting it all behind a paywall for that year three. So yeah, fast forward, they've gone complete U-turn, which not just flipped the switch, but they've actually sort of flipped the model, which I think was going to be 2/3 of the games behind a paywall. Now they went completely, they've opened up the gates. Instead, they started hiring people to be head of sponsorship for their content. So they've completely ripped up the playbook on that approach. Now, I think from what we've talked about, Josh, it feels like it's probably the right move, particularly for the sport. But why do you think DAZN didn't commit to it? Do you think there was a fear factor there, or do you think there was? I can't imagine they just did it because they felt like it was the right thing to do from an audience perspective. I felt like there has to be more to it than that.
Yeah, I guess this deal obviously came off the back of the boom of sort of the women's Euros, and sort of it's sort of in that sort of same timeline, same time period. So I imagine they were probably hope and obviously hoping for a big subscriber boost in terms of growing their platform. So yeah, I wonder whether it was all very quick too soon, I guess. And obviously the competitions format obviously also sort of plays into a bit, because this season you had big popular teams like Arsenal and in Germany Wolfsburg get knocked out before the main competition even started in the qualifying round. So I imagine that would, obviously DAZN are not going to say which teams they wanted in and out of the tournament, but obviously that takes away a significant group of people who would have obviously been tuned in, sort of would have paid up for subscriptions and stuff. So yeah, I guess only they can sort of say whether what the numbers were for the uptake in subscriptions or not. I also think the communication wasn't super clear, because I think they announced. I mean, obviously we all sort of knew it was going for a paywall like for a few years back, but it then sort of emerged like the week of before the season started that they were going to sort of stream some of the games for free, and now they've done a complete U-turn. So it's been an interesting sort of it's sort of like real time decision making that they've sort of made. And yeah, I can only imagine that they weren't getting the results they wanted, and evidently have decided to sort of maybe hit pause on step 3 and step 4 and have gone back to step 1 and step 2, I guess, in the process.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I'd say glass half full on that might be that they might have seen some buoyancy in the revenues that can be created through commercial sponsorship deals. And so maybe that's one of the reasons they thought, well, actually, economically, we're just going to be able to generate more revenue. And so versus the numbers not looking as healthy. I also have seen a sort of a shift in their approach on how they talk about their platform. Shai Segev, who spoke, who's the CEO at DAZN, spoke at Sports Pro Madrid, and I think he spoke about the fact he wants to get 1 billion users on the platform. Right? He's not talking about paid subscribers there. He's talking about just numbers and eyeballs. So it does feel like they are moving, really pivoting away from that whole hard paywall model to make it more, let's capture as many people as we can and bring them into our ecosystem, getting them to use us. They've talked about being a place for gaming. Well, betting is part of the experience, but also they want to be an editorial destination for sports. I haven't seen a lot of momentum on that part, but my guess, is to effectively replicate like an ESPN globally, I suppose, is kind of what I'm thinking. So maybe there's been just a defined like a recalibration of, hey, the subscription business is a graft, it's hard work. We're unclear this is going to move the needle, but we think if we keep it for free, we're just going to get those eyeballs up on our platform and users up accordingly.
I also think that most people, I mean, I speak in the UK, maybe, I mean, now in Germany and in the German-speaking regions, they've launched a freemium tier. But I feel like in terms of market awareness, most consumers sort of associate DAZN with a pay-per-view or a subscription service. So maybe if they've decided sort of launching this freemium tier, and then, as you say, sort of the dialogue switching to being more of a let's get more users on than subscribers. Maybe they're trying to build that market awareness to sort of let consumers know, hey, come see what we have first before you sort of commit to pay. Because obviously in this current economic climate, people are sort of cutting back on subscriptions and are trying to be more tactful in terms of what they pay for. And so maybe there's a bit of that in terms of their sort of current decision making and how they're sort of looking to grow as a platform.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this year goes for them. I don't think we'll see as many numbers as we had previously shared with us as to how it's performed. I've still got their 100-page of company accounts to look through in the coming few weeks, but I haven't had a chance to get into those just of yet. But they won't have many of the information on that arrangement. But I'm a bit disappointed because I really wanted to see if women's football could drive subscriptions, because if it could, it would mean so much more investment coming into the space and sector. We have to wait and see. One of the other things I think that's interesting when we're talking about just generally the idea of going behind a paywall versus not is we often look to the US as like a barometer on how the market's performing, how to generate revenue. But one thing the US does so well that Europe doesn't is that generating of income across just pure advertising revenue, let alone sponsorship. The NFL, for example, has incredible deals in place with free-to-air public linear networks because they're able to generate such incredible income through advertising, which just is not possible. The market is not fit for that purpose in UK and Europe. So that's why I'm hoping maybe they've seen something. Maybe they've seen that there is a bit more of an interest in maybe more of the first-party data that a platform like DAZN can give to partners might be able to unlock something that wasn't historically on the table. But I don't know. It feels like the advertising thing is still an issue that needs to be unlocked for live sports in the UK and European markets. I don't know what you think there, Josh.
Yeah, I also feel that's the case, and obviously, it's mentioned in the article about sort of the challenge of enticing brands to pay an equivalent amount to what they would pay for an advert ahead of on the men's coverage for the women's coverage. And yeah, it feels like it's a space that's still evolving and probably needs to evolve a little bit longer before it reaches, as you say, the US levels. So a bit of a watch that space, but yeah, it'll get there. I'm sure. It's not like it's never going to get there. It's just I think it just requires a bit more time, and obviously, again, we talk about sort of reach. I'm sure having as the game sort of grows its reach, I'm sure it'll encourage more advertisers to sort of open their wallets on that front.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I think that comes to mind, I was going to dig into this a bit later, but I sort of see this perhaps as a bit of an opportunity. It could be they could really take a different approach here. And you mentioned the Caitlin Clark example before, right? Like you think about the way the modern sports media landscape as it sits today, taking initiatives like the Caitlin Clark one, where they're producing something special that's different, that's unique, is going to drive significant engagement on a platform that is such an important destination for fans as well as brands and all stakeholders, really. That type of initiative feels like, well, what could you do with that if you scaled it even further? What could you do with that if all the major athletes who are playing in X league started broadcasting their content, maybe the single player cam type thing, for example, through their own channels imagine the reach and scale. I saw some data shared with me the other day with a company who X and Y, which is a friend of mine, Sean Verity, who's actually been on the pod before, and he's published some stuff on LinkedIn, which is good. Really good insight into like the engagement rates of some of these audiences, and particularly with women's football. Some of the players' engagement rates are off the charts when you compare it to some of the men's counterparts, and in fact, the athletes are even higher than the clubs themselves. So my point there is there something there? Do you think that, what does they commit to a completely different approach here? They work with all the athletes, they broadcast all the content, these unique experiences uh, through their own respective athlete channels, and get this incredible scale that they're able to track, and then share that on with brands and sponsors. That feels like something that is not in the market currently, but with a lack of red tape, I suppose, that might exist in comparison to some of the other more mature men's leagues. That might be a way to, I guess, try a more modern approach to sports media and monetization. What do you think?
Yeah, I sort of a few months ago, or I think before the Women's World Cup, I spoke to someone from TikTok, and they were talking about how they were sort of actively trying to work with the likes of the England goalkeeper Mary Earps, and the Lionesses in terms of amplifying their content because they were so active on it. And indeed, I feel like a lot of these women's footballers have been more, I don't know, keen's not the right word, but they've been more ready to sort of open up their own YouTube channel or TikTok channel or sort of day in the life sort of content, all these sort of shoulder content. So I think, yeah, for sure, I think it does give them a unique opportunity to experiment a bit more with content. And again, we see sort of sometimes, like a YouTuber or streamer has sort of sponsored content and works with brands and stuff. I imagine for women's footballers, there's an opportunity there to do something like that as well, and in a unique way. And yeah, it definitely opens that door. And I'd be curious to see if and I mean, I assume it's going to be a when it's going to happen, but yeah, it certainly opens up a few doors for them for sure.
Well, one thing I do think in this new world of like the creator economy, which is now front and center for everyone to see wherever platform you go to these days, that whilst the free to air might not generate the revenue that they hope pay TV might, what it might do is allow the athletes to create their own little sort of genuine businesses around the opportunity that having that reach that free to air does provide, and they all seem to be pretty up for it. The new age star is very ready to be in front of a camera or a phone or speaking to media, speaking to fans. It is a very different ball game to what it was perhaps a generation ago, where there was that big barrier between athletes and media and fans that created this kind of halo effect on all these players. Now they need to be as accessible as possible, and lean into that. Maybe there is some more opportunity there than that does not follow the existing models of yesteryear. So, Josh, I'm just thinking about some other models that exist, and one of the ones that we hear a lot about covered in the industry, looking back to the US, is Angel City. Angel City has had a lot of coverage for a host of reasons. They've been there's a lot to like about their approach, but it also helps when you have lots of famous people involved, as we've seen lots of sports startups bringing in investors, which are normally athletes, to try and add some star power to the brand. They've done similar, bringing in a whole list of, I guess, A-listers and maybe B-listers and C-listers as well to be involved, given they are in Hollywood. So can you just talk a little bit about what the Angel City's approach is, and do you think their model is something that's replicable, or perhaps it's more the exception rather than the rule?
Yeah, well, under sort of Julie Ehrman, who's obviously spoken at the Sports Pro events recently as well, Angel City, who are a relatively new club to the NWSL, obviously created from scratch, I suppose. They sort of employ a business model that means that 10% of their sponsorship revenue goes back to the local community. So getting these partners on board and having them sort of on board with distributing some of their revenue to sort of local causes and organizations. And the other thing about Angel City that's unique is that they raised capital through a Series A financing round back in 2022. So it's sort of done as a startup, really. So it's an interesting model in that, and it might be unique to them, I guess, on an expansion team, because obviously in places like Europe and the UK, football teams are institutions, right? They're community institutions. They're not really startups in that sense. So yeah, the article that talked that what we've been discussing sort of goes into that, and whether that's something that's a viable thing going forward, because obviously, while it does obviously lift up all these other institutions in the community, and that's what obviously Angel City are doing, whether it works for every single team and whether every team can afford to do that is obviously a completely different question. And yeah, otherwise, and because all these other teams at the moment are sort of heavily reliant on obviously media rights revenue, as we've been discussing. So yeah, it's a unique model. I don't know if you can foresee any other team or club in women's football or even other sort of sports being able to do that, because it feels to me that it's a very unique model that can be done for the US, and especially an expansion team that's come up from nothing essentially.
Yeah, we are seeing more, certainly more big sports stars and athletes and celebrities, etc., putting their name to things, which does innately help open up conversations around partnerships, sponsorships, advertising, etc. I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind when we talk about that stuff is Wrexham, where you see what they've done from a brand perspective, partnerships perspective. I haven't seen all the numbers, but they ain't doing those array of ads that they produce currently across a whole host of different areas for free. They're doing it because they're able to generate some pretty meaningful income from sponsors who want to get involved and have a connection with Ryan Reynolds and co. So if you keep adding that stardust in there and people want a bit of connectivity with someone that really resonates with their audience type, and I think they'll keep producing opportunities for those that do so. And Wrexham's built an example of that I do think is actually replicable in some instances. Replicable in other markets, where add some stars, start at a low tier, follow the journey. Everyone's got a unique journey in that mix. Some will be more hands-on than others. Wrexham came in at the right time, like Drive to Survive did, with this sort of documentary style content. But we've even seen, we published an interview that I did on stage at Sports Pro Live, and it's got nearly 130,000 views on it now on YouTube. And the comments are off the charts. Like, it's not just some people watched it. There is hundreds of people commenting about how Wrexham they've really adopted it just because of the documentary series, and just because of Ryan Reynolds and Ryan McElhenney. So yeah, I don't know. I think that is replicable on a case by case basis. You do need to make sure it's backed up. They have got Sean Harvey involved there, so having good operators to make sure they can bring those ideas to life is probably pretty important. But yeah, it definitely feels like Angel City is probably more than the exception rather than the rule. Yeah. Anyway, moving things on a little bit so we can start wrapping up. But to Josh, to sort of get to a point here where we can get the crystal ball out a little bit and predict the future of where I guess the women's football as a whole will start to take with regards to their media strategy. We've sort of skirted around the edges of that a little bit with what we've talked about, with what DAZN's doing, what the NWSL's doing, what WSL's doing, etc. Do you have a view on whether there's actually a need? There's a lot of cries out potentially that private equity needs to come in. There just needs to be a huge dump of capital into some of these properties, and that giving them the back, I guess, the runway to build and not be too worried about revenue created? Or do you think they need to continue to perhaps go it alone and keep building organically?
I mean, I would personally like to see them keep going it alone. Like, I would like to see how far it goes without sort of needing private equity money. Obviously, that's more of a preference. I don't know if that's really a viable thing per se, but yeah, I think we were referencing the article. I think what Lena from Wasserman makes a really good point is it doesn't matter how much is sort of raised or invested. It's where it's spent, and whether it's a broadcaster like a Sky or something investing in the quality of the product, whether it's, I don't know, a team maybe investing in improving the live experience for a fan in a stadium or wherever. I do think that's where the next step is, I guess, in terms of I'm not as, I mean, money. I mean, obviously, we're expecting revenues to increase. And the big shiny figure will get the headlines. But I'm more interested in to know where the money is being invested in, and how it sort of levels up in terms of all these other aspects that maybe aren't seen on camera. So yeah, I hope, and obviously one of that is going to be sponsorship revenue, but obviously that comes with reach. So yeah, again, I hope that, I think women's football can continue doing it on its own without needing private equity money. But it's obviously private equity money gives you that sort of short term boost and rise quickly, and whether it's sort of whether a firm or would issue conditions on where it's spent and wherever that may hamper the sort of progress. So I'd like to see it go on its own first, but as we're seeing, there's a lot of sports that are finding it hard to say no to these offers, and but I really hope it stays independent for now.
It's a really good point, because you look across the rest of football and you go, okay, well, the league has taken a huge check from CVC to sell its rights to them. The league has done that. Ligue 1, similar. Bundesliga has been umming and ahhing about getting private equity investment for some time. I don't think that's been no formal agreement, but it seems to be inching closer, despite a lot of fans pushing back. And then you look at what's happened in rugby. There's not a lot of great examples where private equity has absolutely opened the floodgates yet. There's not a proven case in football that just throw a bit of cash into it, or rugby, or any other sport really, other than there's some exceptions rather than the rules, I think, sometimes in some of the things we've seen. I'm a bit hesitant to see what it can do. Like, you're putting more money into these sports, just they end up spending more on what players and talent, which is fine, but that doesn't. Let's be honest. Sometimes in some of these sports properties, having one or two extra players can make it really move the needle if they are needle movers. But if they're not needle movers, it's just incremental gains at best, and that money can disappear very quickly when it starts going just to player salaries and so forth. So I think we have to make sure that there's a nice baseline from a salary perspective, so make sure it is properly professional, which I think that's really important. But it can get tricky if it starts going a little bit further than that, and they're really trying to accelerate growth a bit too quickly.
I also find, we've obviously reported a lot on all these deals that private equity firms have done with those major properties, if you talk about. And a lot of them sort of seem to involve that firm taking 10%, 15% of media rights revenue or commercial revenue or whatever it is. And I just don't know whether women's football specifically is in that position where it can afford to give up a percentage of revenue for a fixed number of period, given that we haven't even hit sort of the iceberg in terms of where we think revenue is going to go. We think it's going to go up, obviously. And obviously, a lot of that revenue gets sort of refunneled back into the ecosystem. I just don't know whether we're in that spot where women's football can afford to sort of say, hey, we'll give you X percent of the revenue, because we don't know what that number is, I guess. I mean, not to say that the other properties have reached their cap, but this is obviously a completely different trajectory in a different timeline. So yeah, I'd be reluctant if I was a women's sports property to sort of give up an X percentage of revenue, just because it seems to be a number that's changing year on year, essentially. So it feels like a lot to give up, I guess, to take on that revenue.
Yeah, for sure. And we've actually seen what has happened in Europe with media rights revenues plateauing or dipping, definitely on a per game basis, pretty much in every single market. The notion that media rights revenues will continue to grow up and up and up for something like women's football or any other sport is pretty bold statement at this day and age, even if it is in an earlier stage for women's football to grow, versus what we've talked about a little bit earlier about, can they take in a different approach, not be as dependent on those revenues, and see where they can get to. And that doesn't take a lot of money to do those approaches if they find free-to-air players that are willing to really help grow the game in other ways, i.e. like the example we talked about with coverage on a day-to-day perspective as well. So yeah, I think I'm with you, Josh. It'll be interesting to see what happens there, and indeed I guess also indeed what happens across European football and football more widely, with even what's happening in the MLS. But lots going on across football industry, that is for sure. But look, that is all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Josh. If people want to find you on social media, where can they locate you?
Yeah, so you can find me on X, I guess, as at JoshSim8, although I am starting to, I know you as well, sort of gravitating a bit more towards Threads at the moment. So if people have that, then it's at josh.sim8. Tried to keep it as cohesive as possible. But yeah, those two platforms, I guess. And obviously keep. I'm sure all these people are sport listeners are hopefully Sports Pro readers, but keep reading the stuff we've got on at the moment, because there's a lot of exciting things. And talking about women's football, there's hopefully some new features relating to that to come as well. So keep an eye out for that.
Josh, you've just done a better plug than I've ever done, and I always screw it up. So thank you for stepping in and doing a far better job than I could. But look, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us, and look forward to chatting again with you on the pod sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Before you go, myself and Nick would just like to thank you for tuning into this episode of Streamtime. If you found the episode insightful, please make sure you like and subscribe on whichever platform you listen to. As a growing podcast, we'd greatly appreciate your support in sharing or writing a review. Ultimately, we want this podcast to not only entertain you, but also hopefully help you navigate the digital sports landscape. If you have any feedback on previous episodes or any topics and speakers you'd like to hear from in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find myself and Nick Meacham on LinkedIn or on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @SportsProChris1. Nick can be found @SportsProNick. Of course, if you want to stay fully up to date on the sports business news cycle, please make sure to visit the Sports Pro Media website or sign up to one of our several newsletters to make sure you don't miss anything. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to you joining us next week on the Streamtime podcast.